All right, everybody. Good afternoon. Today's session is on gender and race in the afterlives of Shakespearean performance. I am going to acknowledge that I am giving this particular introduction from the unceded ancestral territories of the Musqueam and Squamish-speaking people in Vancouver, British Columbia. And I would also like to note the Congress has encouraged people to observe a moment of silence today as a way of acknowledging the very, very dark findings that are happening in Kamloops. I'm not going to enforce a 2-minute and 15-second silence on the panelists, but I will encourage everyone today to just take some time, read the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, read the actual calls to action. And if in doubt about what is going on in the nature of First Nations schools, this is a really good time not to reach out to your First Nations colleagues and say, please educate me, but to go down to your local bookstore, and there are hundreds of very good books. And I would be very happy to recommend books to people. This is a subject that's been well written on and well researched. And as Canadians, we have to know this history. Julie Pryor recently defended her SSHRC-funded PhD dissertation in the Department of English at the University of Toronto. Entitled The Silent Shrew, The Taming of the Shrew in Text, Adaptation, and Performance, the project explores how theatrical adaptation from Shakespeare's time through the long 18th century and into the present paves pathways for social change. Julie is presently working on turning her dissertation into a monograph for the Art in Shakespeare series. The book will connect theatrical studies to domestic violence and case law, positioning early modern productions of Shrew, Othello, and Measure for Measure in relation to their later adaptive context, as well as to those plays' legal context in different historical moments. The paper being presented today is an extract from an article in progress for Shakespeare Bulletin. And with that, here is Julie.
Thank you so much for the introduction, Jamie. My talk is called It's a Kind of History, Real Life Couples and the Problem of Genre in 20th Century Productions of The Taming of the Shrew. And actually in the outline for this presentation, I said 19th century, and the production that I decided to end up talking about just for the sake of time is mostly in the 20th century. So that's why there's a discrepancy there. Okay. 2 years following the release of Franco Zeffirelli's 1967 film adaptation, The Taming of the Shrew, starring Elizabeth Taylor and Richard Burton, Burton found himself reflecting on an argument he had had with his wife over hotel towels. He recorded in his diary in September 1969, quote, "I went mad, which ended up with Elizabeth smashing me around the head with her ringed fingers. If any man had done that, I'd have killed him, or any woman either, but I had sufficient sense to stop myself, or I most surely would have put her in the hospital for a long time, or even into the synagogue cemetery for an even longer time. I still boil with fury when I think about it." According to media reports, such fighting was not uncommon between the two actors, who were known for the notoriously turbulent marriage. They were married, divorced for a time, and married once again. Their relationship was eagerly received as the epitome of a comic and yet seriously violent courtship and marriage, as depicted in The Taming of the Shrew, with the play appealing to audiences as a kind of history of their real-life relationship. The reality effect of couple casting in Shrew is compounded by the frequent omission of the induction. The result is that these shrews seem to take the actors' offstage lives as histories as an alternate frame for the play when enacted within, further driving the reality effect and insisting on the pressing relevance of the danger of conflating domestic violence with love. So here's a little outline of my main points for this paper. So many productions of The Taming of the Shrew have relied very heavily on and even become legendary because of the offstage marriage of their onstage protagonists. The Taylor and Burton film adaptation is perhaps the most famous example. This trend, however, began as early as the 1700s, when other actor couples deployed their offstage marriages in service of making these shrews appear more real. As a result, and despite attempts at emphasizing comedy and farce, the play's notorious gender politics made couple cast shrews appear to be about real-life domestic violence and gendered power struggles. From 1905 to 1923, actress Julia Marlowe and E.H. Southern starred in Shrew. Marlowe's history of domestic violence and her highly publicized divorce trial revived ghosts from her past when she played a Catherine who was subjected to the abuse of her real-life romantic interest, Petruchio. The couple's on-stage relationship in more than one way eerily paralleled her first marriage. This paper suggests that the authenticity of the Marlowe Southern production of The Taming of the Shrew marks a development that serves as a microcosm for a process productions beginning in the late 1700s began to take, one where an ever-increasing interest in the authenticity of the performed text is paralleled by increasingly realistic representations of domestic violence. A connected line of inquiry that contemporary reviews of the Southern Marlowe production provoke is how their Shrew made audiences grapple openly with the problem of genre. What I ask is the difference between farce and tragedy, and how does violence help us determine that difference? I contend that the actors' offstage relationships would have been part of the audience negotiation of that question. While the productions were often received as, and even thought of themselves as farcical, they nevertheless always veered towards tragedy by representing abusive relationships. And you can see on this slide here at the top of this film poster, it says the motion pic film they were made for, really driving home that Taylor and Burton, in their case, were really representing their real relationship in the production. And I'm making a case that a similar thing was happening with this Southern Marlowe Shrew. I also explore how, because of what the audience knew or thought they knew about the central couple's offstage relationships, productions naturalized domestic violence. At the same time, these actor relationships urged audiences to not take Shrew's violence too seriously because of the premise that the actors are really in love. A certain amount of abuse is presumed natural in a relationship here, but can ultimately be forgotten once marriage is achieved. This argument, complexly related to the Taylor Burton film and its depiction of violence, suggests that a marriage founded on abuse is somehow indicative of authentic love. This is a newspaper article that I'll talk about here. On 7th December 1899, the New York Times reported that a witness for actress Julia Marlowe tested in divorce court that, and this is here, on 2 different occasions, her then husband, Mr. Tabor, became so enraged that he seized his wife by the throat and choked her severely. A second witness testified that at another time in Atlanta, Georgia, Tabor, also an actor, was so enraged on reading the compliments paid Marlowe by the newspapers that he overthrew a table at which they were eating breakfast and offered her other indignities. Tabor, the Times reported, was jealous of his wife, quote, on account of more favorable reports by the press of her acting than his. And, quote, from that time, which was in 1896, it was claimed that he began to show a dislike for her, which continued to increase. The abuse began as verbal, but ultimately took the form of threats that led to physical violence. Marlowe refused to stand for Tabor's abuse and ended her marriage in a highly publicized trial in 1900. On stage 5 years later, Marlowe played a Catherine who was subjected to the abuse of a Petruchio, played by E.H. Southern, whom she would later marry, that in more than one way eerily paralleled her marriage and real-life experiences. The overlap here dramatized the behavior of the fictional married couple on one hand, and on the other, the married couple representing them. So at first, Southern and Marlowe were not married, then they were engaged, and then they did end up getting married. So there was this trajectory that followed them through that long production history of The Taming of the Shrew. In this regard, then, the Southern Marlowe production of The Taming of the Shrew makes the play appear to come to life by virtue of the actors audiences believe are portraying their actual relationship on the stage. This production marked the beginning of a trend for Shrew performances in the 20th century and beyond, where an ever-increasing interest in the authenticity of the performed text is paralleled by increasingly realistic representations of domestic violence. This heightens Shrew's stakes while engaging audiences in conversations about domestic violence and the state of gender inequality in ways that appeared to have, and often actually had, tangible real-world implications. Well, Tori Herring-Smith describes the Southern Marlowe Shrew, which debuted in Cincinnati in September 1905 as, quote, a sentimental love story. The Southern and Marlowe themselves described it as the wildest sort of farce, and that's the headline here from another New York Times issue. Marlowe's history influenced reception in a way that complicated both of these claims about genre. Despite their efforts to produce a farce, There were grave elements inherent to the violence Petruchio inflicts upon Catherine, and these have as much to do with the perceived merging of the actors' on and off stage lives as they do with the text itself and the stage direction Southern and Marlowe opted to choose for their production. Such issues are impossible to overlook because of the production's generic murkiness, where despite the actors' claims and intentions, farce insistently gives way to realism. Here's an image of Southern playing Petruchio in the early 1900s. Indeed, by the play's end, Marlowe's comical Catherine, no longer the farcical caricature of a shrew, in conjunction with her and Southern's personal influence, complicates their reading of the production and accounts for mixed critical reception. This, in turn, transforms the shrew and its message, authorized by Shakespeare's, at this point, revered text, into a play about real-life violence. Here's some newspaper articles about their marriage, and the public was really eagerly following this trajectory of their relationship. Marlowe and Southern were highly trained independent actors for whom collaboration in Shrew was a crowning moment in their careers. Talk of their burgeoning offstage romance and ongoing rumors about their impending marriage affected their reception as a real-life Catherine and Petruchio in love. At the same time, ideas about their onstage representations were complicated in a way similar to the effect in Burton and Taylor's film. If Southern and Marlowe's Catherine and Petruchio were received as so real, then was the play's violence also real? Is this how a good relationship ought to be? And was Shakespeare, with all the production's claims of authenticity, being used to legitimize this concept? Marlowe's determination and hard-headedness were trademarks of the public image she brought to Shrew and her marriages. Her vehemence and strength are perhaps most evident in an incident with the press that occurred in the 1892-93 season, before her marriage to the abusive Tabor in 1894 led her to suppress her determined spirit. Marlowe recalls that the Indianapolis Journal critic, quote, wrote a review of my productions in which he made a statement that my company was the most inferior one. So she had her own theater company at this time. She writes, "Here was a bloody blow indeed, and the injustice of the attack made me indignant. I felt I had been trodden upon, and like the worm of the fable, I insisted upon turning. I demanded that my manager should take action against the newspaper. Though her manager told her that fighting the press was, quote, hopeless, Marlowe managed to secure a public apology in court. The parallel to Catherine the Shrew, who also fights for her dignity when trodden upon, as Marlowe perceived herself to be, is alluring." On stage as well, and especially following her divorce when she seems to have regained confidence, Marlowe's roles came to bear on her Shrew. And her most famous role preceding Catherine and following her divorce from Tabor was as Mary Tudor in the play When Knighthood Was in Flower, which is her image is here. Theater critic Edward Dithmar compares Mary to Catherine the Shrew, focusing on the woman's shared strength, resistance to the status quo, especially around gender roles, and rage. Beyond drawing explicit similarities between Mary and Catherine, Dithmar's juxtaposition of knighthood's comedy and tragedy and coercion and agency further aligns the heroines. Having gained fame as Mary in over 2 years in the part following her divorce from her abuser, Marlowe's characterization doubtless remained in audience memory when she played Catherine. Southern and Marlowe first joined forces in Romeo and Juliet in September 1904, and here's an image of them here. Behind the scenes, the couple was realizing their compatibility. A New York Times article from August 1911 reveals that, quote, about once every 2 months, the rumor that they were about to wed was started, and these rumors had been circulating regularly for 2 years prior to their summer 1911 wedding. Audiences were clearly intrigued to see their favorite onstage couple in Shakespeare and were eager to connect Southern and Marlowe's on and offstage romantic lives. Julia Marlowe, for her part, pivoted from a highly public abusive marriage and divorce and an equally public, very happy marriage. And this is emblematic of the line her and Southern Shrew seems to have walked between farce and its underlying tragic modes. And in referring to generic modes, I'm grateful to Brian Corman, who pointed me to Alistair Fowler's discussion of modes within a larger genre. So there's some tragedy happening within a play that has an overarching comic trajectory. Marlowe's personal history is a ghost that both haunts and is, or attempts to be, exercised by the farce. While the production clearly tried to be farcical, even early 20th century reviewers were divided about whether the farce always worked as such. This Shrew's dealings with the playtext contributed to the farce-tragedy binary. The first stage acting text was heavily cut the subplot and gave focus to the taming plot. This move emphasizes the fictional relationship as much as it offers a more prominent focus on the leading actors, in turn drawing attention to the biographical overlaps between Marlowe's experience of domestic violence and her later happy marriage. So now most of my slides have extracts from the prompt book. Sorry, just checking, I had a message. Just making sure everything's fine. So while Herring-Smith reads the horseplay as lighthearted, she overlooks both the nuances of Catherine's subjective responses to Petruchio as well as the implications of casting. Considering the incidents in biographical context productively brings the farce into question, accounts for the production's mixed and often confusing critical reception as well. It also moves the play into the liminal space between farce and this Shrew's tragic modes. Audiences, well aware of the couple's offstage lives, would have come to be more likely to receive the Southern Marlowe Shrew as a gradual transition from attempted farce to sentimental comedy, marked by an overriding sense of impending tragedy. One move overtly suggestive of this is the retention of the infamous whip. And if you, I don't know about you, but I have to move the box of speakers, but you can see in this image, Southern is holding a whip, which is something that carried over from productions in the 1700s of The Taming of the Shrew. Okay, so despite a first act marked by over-the-top ridiculousness, the Southern Marlowe Shrew gradually moved towards comic resolution. And the shift is marked by the stage directions, highlighting the actor's attempts at lightheartedness and crucially establishing an overarching tragic mode. At the couple's first meeting, Petruchio, quote, seizes Catherine's hand and tries to kiss it. And so the stage directions are underlined here in red. Just wanna go to the next slide. Okay, so here you see Petruchio seizes Catherine's hands and tries to kiss it, and he continues to try to kiss her throughout the encounter despite her strenuous objections. Soon after, despite her, quote, hitting his hand with a book and her pushing Petruchio away with her hand, he again takes her hand and tries to kiss it. The back and forth continues, with Catherine slapping Petruchio on the cheek, and at his final definitive, will you, nill you, I will marry you, stage directions read, Petruchio kneels and throws his arms about her as she struggles. At this, Catherine, quote, turns her head away. She tries to bite him. He laughs. Marlowe's Catherine then bites her father when the two men conspire, agreeing to the match. In a final protest, Catherine's angry actions conclude the scene. She, quote, throws 3 books at Petruchio. Finally, in her rage, she throws the vase of flowers which are on the table as the curtain falls. I've observed above how Marlowe's experience of verbal and then outright physical violence is reminiscent of Shrew's postmarital shift. Petruchio's actions, like Tabor's, transform into outright abuse and form explicit connections to Marlowe's offstage experiences of domestic violence. This further heightened the tragic modalities underlying the play's farcical and comic elements. On their return journey to Padua, Catherine agrees that it's 5 o'clock, but when Petruchio turns away, she holds up 2 fingers, indicating she knows it is 2. She still has her spirit, but has learned to temper it. Once the company is on its way, Petruchio, quote, with a victorious laugh, turns and, waving whip in the air, leads her by left arm up to the door. He dances ahead of her and she holds her right hand high in the air with 2 fingers waving. While the victorious Petruchio believes he has conquered his wife, what Catherine has learned is not submission, but how to play his game. The intertextual connection created by the whip wielding and the resonances between this Catherine's abuse and Marlowe's first marriage, along with the subtleties of the stage directions, however, harken back to a more tragic view of the play, complicating readings of this scene on the road to Padua as lighthearted. It is on the way to Padua that Petruchio realizes he would rather have a wife who respects him and sees him as a partner than one who blindly submits. Southern and Marlowe convey this without changing Shakespeare's text. When Catherine disagrees with the sun being the moon, Petruchio, saying nothing but crossed, quote, throws his hat down on the stage and sits on a bench, burying his face in his hands. Caterina is furious and folds her arms. Both soon see the futility of winning and decide to have fun, with Catherine quickly agreeing, without Petruchio threatening this time. She notices he has softened, that Vincentio is a young budding virgin. Catherine speaks to the old man in endearing tones, as you can see here, apparently now having fun with the game. The couple's first genuine sign of mutuality, however, comes later than in some productions. Here, the relational shift actually occurs during the wife wager. Kate has returned to Petruchio and he instructs her to fetch the other woman. Stage directions indicate that, quote, she starts to go and stops again when he continues. He uses a commanding tone. She looks at him and they exchange an understanding glance, and then he adopts a softer tone. And this is where I see the shift occurring, with him reading her reaction and then softening. Finally, they smile at each other and Kate departs. When Petruchio asks Kate to remind the headstrong woman of their conjugal duties, stage directions read, Caterina, protesting, falls on stool. But when the men push the widow and Bianca towards her, she obliges, and as she speaks, quote, Petruchio slaps her on the back as she passes. Toward the speech's end, Catherine and Petruchio are at last on the same page, for at come, come, you forward and enable worms, Caterina smiles at Petruchio and he points to himself. Communicating their mutual pleasure, the couple is in on the speech together, satisfying the audience's eagerness to see Southern and Marlowe happily married. When Catherine offers her last line, my hand is ready, may it do him ease, stage directions read, Caterina starts to put her left hand on the floor. Petruchio seizes her hand and kisses it, and then places his own on the floor. She places her foot on his hand. And at this he replies, why, there's a wench. Come on and kiss me, Kate. In the end, the couple achieves mutuality. Catherine willingly placing her hand on the floor and he kissing her hand rather than treading on it. Their actions with the wager money solidify their shared epiphany about marriage. Stage directions read, quote, Petruchio takes her to him and kisses her. She holds up her dress and he takes the gold he has won and pours it all into her lap as the curtains close, and that's how the play ends. In tracing the production's generic transition, I have noted that the problematic elements of the farcical scenes occur in the midst of the shift from farce to comedy, wherein it is unclear to the audience whether they ought to laugh or cry out in horror at Petruchio's violence and Catherine's suffering. This generic back and forth, represented in part in Petruchio's conflicting actions and words, undoubtedly meant to confuse and disorient Catherine, is what perhaps resulted in the play's confused critical reception. And I'm going to go over this part very briefly. I have a lot more I could say about the critical reception, but here's just an overview. So reviewers are quick to reconcile Southern's gentlemanly Petruchio with his violent outbursts, but in doing so, they legitimize the play's vision of a real-life marriage based on love turned violent. These intersections bring the Shrew narrative full circle and back to the conflict the play originally emphasized, that between a husband and wife, but here more in a concerning way, with the latent offstage relationship between Southern and Marlowe, along with Marlowe's own history of violence lurking behind these readings. It overtly merges to condone the play's representation and possibly justification of violent marriage. In productions starring real-life husbands and wives, then, the implications of violent stagings are all the more important because audiences are aware that a real couple stands before them. In earlier commentary surrounding 18th and 19th century shrews, biographical and repertorial concerns around shrew actors distanced the play from the type of realism achieved in couple-cast shrews. Although Southern's Petruchio never physically harms his bride, an observation most reviewers are quick to make, he emotionally abuses and coercively controls Catherine. The added real-life relationship between the actors heightens these representations. Overall, production reviews reflect an interpretive shift away from the taming of a shrew to the transformation of a crassly domineering husband, a real-life lesson on the dangers of acting as Tabor treated Marlowe. Marlowe's defense of herself in court, my cat is saying hi, in a time where divorce was highly stigmatized, and her public revelation of Tabor's abuse presented a public proclamation. Abuse is never acceptable. What my discussion of married casting in Shrew might ultimately suggest is that such productions, instead of being inherently problematic and legitimizing violence and deploying Shakespeare to do so, can function as agents for challenging oppressive relational norms. By reframing the play in relation to troubled realities of the actors' offstage marriages, these productions not only further problematize the play's generic categorization, but make Shrew a play not so distant from reality as the sly frame establishes, and more about real life. When audiences leave the theater believing they have witnessed real violence, Shrew gains pressing real-world relevance, with audiences compelled to actively participate in social change. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. There's so many things about this last year that need to end, but the introduction of fuzzy visitors while people give talks is just about the best thing ever. So I'm so glad we got to meet your cat.